Harlem never truly slept. Even in the quietest hours of the night, the neighborhood carried a rhythm of its own. Music drifted through half-open apartment windows. Taxi headlights slid slowly across wet pavement. Somewhere down the block, a saxophone hummed softly from a late-night club where the band refused to stop playing. Street lamps painted the sidewalks in dull yellow circles. Neon lights flickered above bars and diners that had seen thousands of nights. Just like this one. Ordinary, predictable, alive, but on this particular night, something interrupted the rhythm. First came the sirens. One car, then another, then a third. Their sharp cries cut through Harlem's midnight atmosphere like broken glass. People turned their heads. Curtains shifted behind apartment windows. A few doors opened as neighbors stepped outside to see what had happened. Sirens were nothing new in New York, but there was something about the urgency in these that made people uneasy. The police cars slowed to a stop near a dim corner of the street. Their red and blue lights began spinning wildly against brick buildings and steel fire escapes. Within minutes, the sidewalk filled with quiet observers. In Harlem, people knew how to watch without getting too close. They stood in doorways, leaning against parked cars. Arms folded, eyes alert. Nobody spoke loudly. Because the scene in front of them was already speaking for itself. Yellow police tape stretched across the pavement. Officers moved carefully around a single figure lying still on the ground. A young girl, 18 years old. Her name was Ruby Williams. To most of Harlem, Ruby wasn't a stranger. She wasn't famous. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She was simply one of the many young faces growing up in a neighborhood that had seen both beauty and hardship. Some people remembered seeing her walking home from school. Others remembered her helping her mother carry groceries up the apartment steps. A few remembered the way she laughed with friends outside the corner store on warm evenings. Ruby Williams was the kind of person a neighborhood quietly protected, or at least tried to. Now she lay at the center of a crime scene no one could fully understand. Police officers spoke in low voices as they worked. One detective scribbled notes into a small notebook. Another walked slowly along the edge of the sidewalk, scanning the ground for anything unusual. But something about the investigation felt strange. The detectives weren't rushing. They weren't shouting orders. They moved with a careful calm that felt distant, almost cautious. A few experienced residents noticed it immediately. They had lived long enough to recognize the difference between a case the police intended to solve and one they might prefer to forget. Within half an hour, an ambulance arrived. But the paramedics already knew what the officers knew. There was nothing they could do. The crowd grew larger. Whispers began moving through it like wind through tall grass. What happened? Who was it? Someone covered their mouth in shock. Someone else shook their head. Slowly, the answers were unclear, at least officially, because sometimes the truth in Harlem didn't begin with police reports. It began with conversations. Inside barbershops, behind restaurant counters. In the quiet corners of jazz clubs where people listened carefully before speaking. And before the night had even ended, the neighborhood was already talking. By morning, Ruby Williams' name had traveled through nearly every street in Harlem. People repeated the details they knew, and the many details they didn't. Some said Ruby had simply been walking home. Others believed she had accidentally seen something she wasn't meant to see. A few whispered that dangerous men had been nearby. Earlier that night, men who didn't belong in that part of Harlem, men who brought trouble with them. Nobody could prove any of it. But one thing was clear: Ruby Williams had not been part of the underworld. She wasn't involved in gang disputes. She wasn't connected to criminals. She was just a girl who had been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. And that fact unsettled the entire neighborhood. Because if someone like Ruby could become a victim, then nobody felt completely safe. The police investigation continued, at least on paper. Detectives questioned a few witnesses. They reviewed the scene, filed their early reports. But the urgency many residents expected never fully appeared. No dramatic arrests. No press conferences, no sudden breakthroughs. Just quiet paperwork, quiet patrols, quiet uncertainty. For many people in Harlem, that silence felt familiar, or too familiar. The city had seen countless cases slowly fade into the background. Another tragedy added to a growing list. Another file pushed deeper into a drawer. But Harlem had something the rest of the city often in memory and pride. Ruby Williams had grown up here. People knew her. People cared, and slowly, another kind of conversation began spreading across the neighborhood. A conversation about justice, not the kind delivered by courtrooms, but the kind sometimes enforced by the streets themselves. It started with a name that carried weight. In Harlem, long before Ruby's story began, Bumpy Johnson. For years, Bumpy Johnson had existed in a strange space between legend and reality. Officially, he was known as a powerful figure in Harlem's underworld, a man connected to gambling operations, street politics, and complicated alliances with larger, criminal organizations. But that description never fully captured who he was. Too many residents. Bumpy Johnson represented something more complicated. Power, control, and in certain situations, protection. He wasn't a loud man. He didn't appear in newspapers making speeches. He rarely raised his voice, yet his presence could quiet an entire room. Business owners respected him. Criminals feared crossing him, and politicians understood that. Harlem functioned differently than other parts of New York. In Harlem, influence did not always come from City Hall. Sometimes it came from men who understood the streets better than anyone wearing a badge, and Bumpy Johnson understood the streets better than most. More importantly, he believed the neighborhood had rules, unspoken ones, lines that should never be crossed. You didn't bring chaos to Harlem. You didn't endanger the people who lived there, and you certainly didn't harm innocent young women. When word of Ruby Williams' death reached Bumpy Johnson, the room around him reportedly fell silent. Those present later described the moment in different ways. Some said he had been sitting calmly, listening to a conversation about business. Others believed the news arrived through a nervous messenger, who struggled to explain what had happened. But every version of the story agreed on one detail. Bumpy Johnson did not react with anger. He did not slam his fist on the table. He did not shout. Instead, he asked a simple question. What happened to the girl? The explanation came slowly. An 18-year-old. No connection to crime, dead on a Harlem street. The police uncertain, the neighborhood afraid. Bumpy listened without interrupting. His expression remained unreadable. Then he asked another question. Do we know who did it? No one had a clear answer, at least not yet. But in Harlem, answers had a way of appearing when certain people started asking the right questions. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. The room remained quiet. Some say he paused for a long moment, thinking carefully about what he had just heard. Others say the decision came instantly. What happened next would become one of those stories people repeated for decades afterward. Because according to many who were present, Bumpy Johnson gave Harlem a deadline: 3 days. 3 days to find out who was responsible for Ruby Williams' death. 3 days before he handled the situation himself. There was no announcement, no written statement, no official declaration. Yet, somehow the message spread across Harlem faster than any newspaper headline. By midday, people were already repeating it in barbershops, at street corners, inside crowded restaurants. Bumpy heard about Ruby. They say he's looking into it. 3 days. That number appeared again and again. 3 days. To outsiders, it might have sounded like a rumor, but the people who understood Harlem knew better. When Bumpy Johnson made a decision, the streets responded, and almost immediately, they did. Something subtle began changing across the neighborhood. Men who normally spent their evenings leaning casually on street corners suddenly seemed less relaxed. Conversations ended abruptly when unfamiliar faces walked nearby. A few individuals quietly left town without explanation. Others simply disappeared from their usual routines, because somewhere out there, the men responsible for Ruby Williams' death were starting to hear the same whispers everyone else heard. And they understood exactly what those whispers meant. The police investigation continued, but now another investigation had begun. One without paperwork, one without press conferences, one moving quietly through Harlem's hidden networks of bartenders, taxi drivers, club owners, and street informants. The kind of network that often knew the truth long before the authorities did. The countdown had started. Day 1, and somewhere in Harlem, the man asking the questions was known for one thing above all else: when he asked for answers, the city usually found them. Long before the name Ruby Williams began echoing through Harlem's streets, another name had already settled deep into the neighborhood's history, a name spoken with equal parts respect, curiosity, and caution. Bumpy Johnson. In Harlem, power did not always look the way outsiders imagined. It did not always wear a police badge, it did not always sit behind a judge's desk, and it certainly did not always arrive with sirens and flashing lights. Sometimes power moved quietly. Sometimes it sat in the corner of a crowded room, listening more than speaking, and sometimes it belonged to a man who rarely needed to raise his voice. Bumpy Johnson was that man. But the legend of Bumpy Johnson did not begin with power. It began with survival. Decades earlier, before the expensive suits and controlled authority, Bumpy had been just another young man navigating the rough streets of Harlem. The neighborhood was different back then, still vibrant with music and culture, but shadowed by poverty, crowded tenements, and the constant pressure of survival. Opportunity was rare. Respect was even rarer. And for a young black man in early 20th century New York, the rules were stacked against you from the start. But Bumpy Johnson was never interested in following rules written by other men. People who knew him in his early years often described him as unusually observant. He didn't rush into fights, he didn't boast. Instead, he watched, listened, or studied the way people behaved when money was involved, the way fear moved through a room, the way power quietly shifted between men who appeared equal on the surface, some say. Bumpy learned early that strength alone meant very little. Intelligence meant everything, and that lesson shaped the man he eventually became. By the time Harlem entered its roaring nightlife era filled with jazz clubs, packed dance halls, and underground gambling, Bumpy Johnson had already begun building a reputation, not as the loudest man in the room, but as one of the most calculated. Harlem's nightlife was booming. Music flowed from clubs until sunrise. Money moved through gambling tables and private card rooms hidden behind restaurant kitchens and barbershops. Where money moved, power followed. And where power gathered, Bumpy Johnson slowly positioned himself. He didn't rush to dominate territory the way other criminals did. Instead, he built relationships. Club owners trusted him to keep order. Street operators respected his word. Even rivals noticed something unusual about him. Bumpy Johnson had rules. Rules in the underworld were rare, but Bumpy believed they were necessary. He believed chaos was bad for business, and he believed Harlem worked best when someone maintained balance between the different forces operating inside it. That balance became his greatest strength. Over time, the numbers racket Harlem's massive underground lottery system became one of the most powerful economic engines in the neighborhood. Millions of dollars moved through it every year. The police tried to stop it. Politicians tried to regulate it, but the streets had their own way of keeping the system alive. Bumpy Johnson eventually rose to control large portions of that world, not by violence alone, but by organization, by negotiation, by knowing exactly when to push forward and when to step back. Even members of the Italian Mafia who dominated organized crime across much of New York recognized Bumpy's influence in Harlem. One of the most famous alliances in underworld history formed between Bumpy Johnson and the powerful Italian mob boss Lucky Luciano, two outsiders. The partnership seemed unlikely to men from completely different backgrounds, to different criminal empires, but they understood something simple. Harlem operated differently than the rest of New York, and Bumpy Johnson was the one man who could keep it stable. Their arrangement allowed Bumpy to maintain control over Harlem's operations while working within the broader criminal networks that stretched across the city. It was a delicate balance, but Bumpy managed it better than anyone expected, because he understood the most important rule of power. Respect. Respect kept deals intact. Respect kept deals violence from spiraling out of control, and respect was something Bumpy Johnson demanded, and usually received. Yet despite his reputation as a crime boss, many Harlem residents saw him through a different lens. To them, Bumpy Johnson was more complicated than a gangster. He was someone who understood the neighborhood, someone who grew up on the same streets, that's someone who knew the difference between criminals and innocent people just trying to survive. That distinction mattered to him, at least according to the stories told by those who lived through that era, some say. Bumpy quietly paid rent for struggling families. Others believe he ensured local businesses could operate without harassment from outside gangs. There were even whispers that certain crimes simply didn't happen in Harlem without Bumpy hearing about them first. Whether every story was true didn't really matter, because the belief itself carried power. When people believed someone was protecting the neighborhood, they behaved differently, and criminals thinking about causing trouble often reconsidered their plans. This reputation created a strange paradox. Officially, Bumpy Johnson was part of the criminal underworld. Unofficially, many Harlem residents viewed him as something closer to a guardian. Not a hero, but a man who understood the responsibility that came with controlling the streets. Which is why Ruby Williams' death struck such a deep nerve across the neighborhood, because Ruby represented everything the streets were supposed to protect. She wasn't a gambler, she wasn't involved in illegal deals, she wasn't a threat to anyone. She was simply a young girl growing up in Harlem, and according to the unwritten rules, Bumpy Johnson believed in people like Ruby were never supposed to become victims. When the news reached him, those who witnessed the moment said something subtle changed in his expression. Not rage, not shock, something quieter, something colder. Because Bumpy Johnson understood what Ruby's death meant. It meant someone had crossed a line that had kept Harlem stable for years. If outsiders believed they could enter the neighborhood, harm innocent people, and walk away without consequences, then the entire balance of the streets would collapse. And Bumpy Johnson had spent decades making sure that balance held, which is why the simple question he asked carried so much weight. Who did it? It was not a question asked in anger, it was a calculation, a starting point, because Bumpy knew something the police often forgot in Harlem. Information moved faster than official investigations. Bartenders heard conversations no detective ever would. Taxi drivers remembered faces that police officers overlooked. Musicians playing late-night clubs saw who arrived and who left in a hurry. The neighborhood itself was a network of witnesses. All it required was the right person asking the right question. And once Bumpy Johnson began asking questions, Harlem listened. Word spread quietly through the streets. Bumpy was looking into Ruby Williams' death. Almost immediately, the atmosphere began shifting. People spoke more carefully. Certain individuals became difficult to find. Others started sharing small details they might normally keep to themselves. Because everyone understood one thing. When Bumpy Johnson decided something mattered, the investigation would not stop easily. Not until the truth appeared, and somewhere in Harlem, the people responsible for Ruby Williams' death were beginning to realize something terrifying. The police might take weeks, maybe months, maybe longer, but Bumpy Johnson rarely needed that much time. The man Harlem answered to had begun asking questions, and the streets had already started whispering back. In a city as large and restless as New York City, tragedies happened every day. Sirens echoed through neighborhoods. Police reports filled endless filing cabinets, and names of victims, many of them young, quietly disappeared into statistics that few people ever read again. But Harlem was different. Harlem remembered. It was the kind of place where people noticed when someone didn't come home at night, where barbershop conversations could carry stories across entire blocks before the sun even rose. So when the news spread that an 18-year-old girl named Ruby Williams had been found dead, the neighborhood reacted in a way the rest of the city rarely did. At first, the story arrived quietly. A police car outside a narrow apartment building. Yellow tape stretching across a dimly lit sidewalk. Few officers speaking in low voices, while curious neighbors watched from windows above. To the police, it looked like another late-night crime scene. Another case that would require statements, paperwork, and weeks of investigation. But the people who lived in Harlem sensed something different almost immediately. Because Ruby Williams didn't belong to the world that usually produced these tragedies. She wasn't involved in street disputes. She wasn't connected to gambling, operations, or underworld deals. She wasn't even known to spend time around the kinds of places where criminals gathered. Ruby was simply part of the neighborhood, a young woman who walked past the same storefronts every morning, who greeted the same shop owners, who occasionally stopped to listen when Jasmine's music drifted out of late-night clubs. People remembered seeing her laughing with friends, carrying books, walking quickly down the sidewalk with the confident rhythm of someone who believed the neighborhood around her was familiar and safe. That was why the news unsettled everyone, because Ruby Williams represented something ordinary, and ordinary people were not supposed to become victims of the underworld, not in Harlem at least. Not according to the rules that had quietly governed the streets for years. The police investigation began the way these investigations often did. Officers knocked on doors. Witnesses were questioned. Notes were scribbled into small notebooks under the dim glow of streetlights. But from the very beginning, something about the investigation felt uncertain. Some residents noticed that detectives seemed unusually cautious when discussing the case. Others believed certain questions were never asked at all. A few even claimed officers quietly encouraged witnesses to avoid speculation about what might have happened. Officially, the death of Ruby Williams remained an unsolved case. Unofficially, Harlem began forming its own theories. And Harlem had many theories. Inside crowded barbershops, men leaned forward in their chairs, lowering their voices as they discussed what they had heard. In smoky jazz clubs, musicians paused between sets to whisper about rumors drifting through the neighborhood. Taxi drivers, who spent long nights observing the city's hidden movements, began recalling strange details they had once dismissed as unimportant. Little pieces of information began floating through the streets. Nothing confirmed, nothing proven, but enough to form a darker picture. Some said Ruby had accidentally witnessed something she wasn't meant to see, a meeting, a deal, a conversation between men who preferred their business to remain hidden. Others believed she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the middle of an argument between dangerous individuals whose patience had already run thin. A few even suggested something more complicated that Ruby had recognized. Someone connected to a powerful group operating in Harlem who believed removing a witness was easier than explaining themselves later. No one knew which story was true. Maybe none of them were. But one detail appeared in almost every version of the rumor. The men responsible were not local, they were outsiders. And outsiders breaking Harlem's rules had always created problems. Because Harlem was not simply another neighborhood in New York, it was a community with its own quiet order. For decades, that order had been shaped by the presence of one man, Bumpy Johnson. By the time Ruby Williams' death became the center of neighborhood conversation, Bumpy Johnson had already built a reputation unlike any other figure in the city's underworld. He did not rely on public displays of power. He did not announce his influence in newspapers, but people understood something very clearly when serious problems appeared in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson eventually heard about them, and when he heard about them, things began to change. At first, there was no dramatic reaction, no public statements, no confrontations in crowded streets, just a quiet shift in the atmosphere, the kind of shift only people who lived in Harlem long enough could recognize. Conversations stopped more quickly when strangers approached. Certain individuals who normally spent their evenings on familiar corners suddenly disappeared for a few days. Club owners began closing their doors earlier than usual. Some residents didn't understand why. Others knew exactly what it meant. Bumpy Johnson had started asking questions, and when Bumpy Johnson asked questions, answers usually followed. His methods were not the same as the police. Detectives relied on official procedures, witness statements, evidence, reports, courtroom testimony. Bumpy Johnson relied on something far older, the network of the streets. Bartenders who overheard private conversations, delivery drivers who noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside certain buildings, waiters who remembered which customers appeared nervous when particular names were mentioned. Harlem was full of observers, and many of them trusted Bumpy more than they trusted the authorities, because the police could arrest someone. But Bumpy Johnson could prevent chaos before it started. Within hours of his first quiet inquiries, the information began moving. Small details, strange sightings, half-remembered conversations. Nothing that would solve the case immediately, but enough to create patterns, and Bumpy Johnson was very good at recognizing patterns. Some say he spent hours sitting silently in a private office above a nightclub, listening as different people delivered fragments of information. Others believe he walked through Harlem late at night, speaking with individuals who knew the streets better than any police officer ever could. No one knows exactly how he gathered his intelligence, but by the end of the first day, something unusual began happening. The people who might have been responsible for Ruby Williams' death started behaving differently. Men who normally appeared confident became cautious. Meetings were cancelled, plans changed. Certain cars left Harlem without explanation. It was almost as if the entire underworld had sensed a shift. Because when Bumpy Johnson began searching for answers, the streets rarely remained quiet for long. Meanwhile, the official investigation continued moving slowly. Detectives followed procedures. Reports were filed. Statements were reviewed. But, compared to the quiet momentum building inside Harlem's hidden networks, the law felt almost stationary. And people noticed. Residents began whispering about the contrast. The police investigation looked uncertain, but the streets felt alive with activity. By the second day after Ruby Williams' death, something even more unsettling began circulating through the neighborhood. Names. At first, the names were vague. Descriptions rather than identities, a group of men who had recently appeared in Harlem. Men who had been seen entering clubs where they had no usual connections. Men who seemed interested in deals that didn't belong to them. Slowly, the descriptions became more specific. A particular car, a particular bar, a particular face that several people suddenly remembered. Seeing near the wrong place at the wrong time. It was still rumor, still speculation. But rumors in Harlem had a strange way of turning into facts, and once those names began moving through the neighborhood, people understood something very important. The men responsible for Ruby Williams' death were no longer invisible. Someone knew who they were, and eventually that information would reach the man Harlem listened to, because by the second night after Ruby's death, one truth had already settled into the streets like a heavy shadow. The police might take months to uncover the full story, but Bumpy Johnson rarely needed that long. The crime that many believed would quietly fade into another unsolved case had become something else entirely. A turning point, a moment when Harlem itself began responding, and somewhere in the city, the men responsible were starting to understand the danger they had created, because their biggest mistake wasn't committing the crime. Their biggest mistake was committing it in Harlem, a neighborhood that remembered, a neighborhood that talked, and a neighborhood where certain questions were never ignored for long. Harlem had always been a place where news moved faster than the police. Not through newspapers, not through radio announcements, but through something far older. Whispers. A bartender hearing something at midnight, a cab driver noticing a nervous passenger, a doorman recognizing a face that didn't belong. In Harlem, information traveled quietly, but it traveled everywhere. And 2 days after Ruby Williams was killed, the whispers changed. They carried a message, not written, asterisk, not spoken loudly, but understood by everyone who mattered. 3 days. That was the number moving through Harlem streets. 3 days to explain what happened to Ruby Williams. 3 days before something else happened. The message had come from only one man, Bumpy Johnson. No one could say exactly when he delivered the warning. Some said it happened during a late-night conversation inside a jazz club office. Others believed the message was passed through trusted lieutenants who quietly repeated the same words across the neighborhood. But by the next morning, the meaning was clear. Harlem had been given a deadline, and people who understood the underworld knew something important about Bumpy Johnson. He rarely made threats. He simply announced decisions. For many criminals operating in Harlem, that distinction mattered, because threats could be ignored, decisions could not. The strange thing about the ultimatum was how calm it sounded. There were no angry speeches, no public displays of power, just a quiet expectation that the truth would surface within 72 hours. But those 72 hours felt longer than anyone expected, because once the message spread, the atmosphere inside Harlem changed almost immediately. Nightclubs that normally stayed open until sunrise suddenly closed early. Certain men stopped appearing at their usual card tables. Street corners that were usually crowded with conversation became strangely quiet. People were watching, listening, waiting. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like a chessboard where every piece had suddenly become cautious. Some residents didn't fully understand why the tension had grown so heavy, but the people who worked inside Harlem's hidden economy understood exactly what was happening. Bumpy Johnson had activated the streets. The police noticed the change too. Detectives investigating Ruby Williams' death began hearing unusual things during their interviews. Witnesses who previously claimed they knew nothing suddenly remembered small details. Someone recalled a car parked nearby. Another remembered seeing unfamiliar men leaving a building. A third mentioned hearing an argument earlier that evening. But even the detectives sensed something unusual. The information was arriving too quickly, too precisely. It was as if another investigation had already begun, one operating quietly beneath the official one, and that investigation was moving faster. Meanwhile, the people who might have been responsible for Ruby's death were beginning to realize their situation had changed. Before the ultimatum, they believed the city's usual rules applied. Commit a crime, avoid witnesses, disappear into the chaos of New York, let time bury the evidence. But Harlem was not behaving like the rest of the city. Instead of forgetting, The neighborhood was focusing. Instead of moving on, the streets were closing in. Rumors suggested the men responsible had been seen leaving certain locations late at night. Other whispers claimed they were trying to contact people who could help them disappear. Some even believed they had attempted to leave Harlem entirely. But leaving Harlem after attracting Bumpy Johnson's attention was rarely simple. Because Harlem was more than a location. It was a network, a system of eyes and ears that extended far beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. Taxi drivers noticed passengers heading toward train stations. Hotel clerks remembered late-night guests checking in under unfamiliar names. Even delivery workers paid attention to addresses that suddenly seemed important. The streets were watching, and the clock was ticking. The first day of the ultimatum passed quietly, too quietly. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public accusations, just the slow tightening of an invisible net. Bumpy Johnson remained calm. Those who saw him during that time later described the same impression. He appeared thoughtful, patient, almost attached, as if he already understood something. The rest of Harlem was still discovering. People close to him later claimed he asked very few questions. He simply listened, sometimes for hours. Information arrived in fragments. License plate number, a familiar face seen near the wrong building, a conversation overheard in the corner of a dimly lit bar. Each piece alone meant very little, but together, they formed a map, and Bumpy Johnson was very good at reading maps. That by the second day, Harlem's criminals began reacting more seriously. Some individuals suddenly became cooperative with people they normally avoided. Rival groups that usually competed for territory seemed strangely eager to share information. Even men who disliked Bumpy Johnson personally understood something important. If someone had violated Harlem's unwritten rules by killing an innocent girl, they had created a problem for everyone. Because chaos attracted attention, and attention from outside forces, politicians, federal agents. Powerful organizations could disrupt the delicate balance that allowed Harlem's underground world to function. So the streets began cooperating, not out of kindness, but out of survival. By the second night, the whispers had changed again. This time, they carried something more dangerous than rumors. Names. At first the names moved carefully, spoken only in private conversations. But once they appeared, the tension in Harlem grew sharper. Because names meant responsibility, and responsibility meant consequences. Some residents claimed the men connected to those names had already begun panicking. One story suggested they were trying to arrange protection from powerful associates. Another rumor claimed they attempted to leave New York entirely, but the city is not easy to escape when enough people are paying attention. And by now, Harlem was paying very close attention. The third day arrived with a strange sense of inevitability. Even the weather seemed to reflect the mood. Gray clouds hung low above the streets. Wind moved through narrow alleys, carrying distant sounds of traffic and conversation. Inside cafes and barbershops, people spoke quietly. Everyone knew the deadline had arrived, and everyone wondered the same thing. What would happen when the 3 days ended? No one expected a public spectacle. That was never Bumpy Johnson's style. His power came from something far more subtle. Decisions made behind closed doors, conversations that ended problems before they became visible, solutions that left very little evidence behind. But Harlem understood something important. When the clock reached the end of those 3 days, something would change. Because Bumpy Johnson had asked a question, and in Harlem, questions from him rarely remained unanswered. As night approached on the final day, a strange calm settled over the neighborhood. The tension was still there, but it felt different now. Less like uncertainty, more like anticipation. Some people claimed they saw unfamiliar cars moving quietly through the street. Others believed certain men had been summoned to private meetings. No one could confirm the details, but everyone sensed the same thing. The moment was close, and somewhere in the city, the men responsible for Ruby Williams' death were realizing that the deadline had arrived. Because in Harlem, when Bumpy Johnson gave the streets 3 days, the story rarely lasted a fourth. In the dangerous and complex world of Harlem's underground economy, power was never permanent. Every powerful figure understood that respect could disappear overnight, and loyalty was often fragile. For Bumpy Johnson, maintaining power was not just about violence or intimidation. It was about balance, balancing fear with respect, loyalty with authority, and business with survival. By the time Bumpy Johnson had fully established himself as one of Harlem's most powerful crime figures, he had already seen the rise and fall of many other gang leaders. Some ruled through terror, others tried to control everything alone, but Bumpy believed something different. He believed power lasted longer when people followed you because they respected you, not just because they feared you. However, in the criminal world, even respect had a price. One of the most important reasons Bumpy Johnson was able to survive for so long in the crime world was the loyalty of the people around him. Loyalty didn't appear automatically, it had to be earned. Unlike many crime bosses who treated their associates as disposable tools, Bumpy often showed loyalty to those who proved themselves trustworthy. People who worked under him understood that if they stayed loyal, he would protect them. That reputation spread quickly across Harlem's streets. Many small-time hustlers, runners, and street-level workers preferred to work for Bumpy rather than for other bosses. Under his leadership, they believed they had a better chance of surviving the dangerous world of organized crime. But loyalty worked both ways. Anyone who betrayed Bumpy Johnson faced serious consequences. In that environment, betrayal could destroy an entire organization. Information leaks could lead to arrests, robberies, or rival gangs taking over territories. So while Bumpy rewarded loyalty, he was extremely strict about betrayal. Trust was valuable, and once it was broken, it was rarely repaired. At the peak of his influence, Bumpy Johnson controlled multiple underground businesses operating throughout Harlem. These operations generated huge amounts of money, and managing them required discipline and organization. Unlike chaotic street gangs, Bumpy's operations functioned almost like a business network. There were people responsible for specific tasks: collecting payments, managing territories, transporting goods, and maintaining connections. This structured system helped Bumpy maintain control over a large territory. It also allowed him to keep order among the many individuals working under his authority. In Harlem, reputation was everything. If a leader lost control of his operations, rivals would quickly move in to take advantage. Because of this, Bumpy paid close attention to every part of his organization. He understood that success in the crime world required intelligence, planning, and patience. One of the most unusual aspects of Bumpy Johnson's reputation was that some members of the Harlem community respected him. Despite his involvement in illegal activities starred in neighborhoods where poverty and limited opportunities made life difficult, powerful figures sometimes became symbols of strength or protection. Some residents believed that Bumpy helped maintain order on the streets, preventing random violence or exploitation by outside gangs. Stories circulated about him helping local families, assisting people who were struggling financially, or stepping in when conflicts threatened to get out of control. Whether every story was true or not, these stories helped shape his image in the community that too many people in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson was more than just a criminal figure. He was seen as someone who understood the struggles of the neighborhood. This reputation gave him an advantage. Community respect could sometimes act as an invisible shield. People were less likely to cooperate with outsiders who tried to challenge his influence. Even with loyalty and respect, Bumpy Johnson's power was never completely secure. Rival groups constantly looked for opportunities to expand their influence. Harlem's underground world was full of ambitious individuals who wanted to control profitable territories. Some believed they were smarter, stronger, or more ruthless than the existing leaders. Because of this, Bumpy had to stay alert at all times. Every new face entering the street could be a potential threat. Every disagreement had the potential to escalate into a larger conflict. In that environment, a single mistake could lead to serious consequences. Instead of reacting impulsively, Bumpy often relied on strategy. He studied his rivals, learnt their weaknesses, and waited for the right moment before making decisions. This careful approach helped him avoid unnecessary conflicts while protecting his position. Being at the top of Harlem's underground world came with constant pressure. Many people depended on Bumpy Johnson. Associates, workers, and partners all relied on his leadership. If he made the wrong decision, it could affect dozens of people connected to his organization. Leadership in that environment required more than just strength. It required judgment, discipline, and emotional control. A leader who reacted too quickly or allowed personal anger to guide decisions could easily create chaos. Bumpy Johnson understood this responsibility. Even though he lived in a dangerous world, he tried to maintain control over his actions. Those who worked closely with him often noticed that he preferred careful thinking over reckless behavior. Respect in Harlem's streets came with a heavy price. Maintaining a powerful reputation meant constantly proving strength and authority. If a leader appeared weak, even for a moment, others would quickly challenge him. Because of this reality, Bumpy Johnson had to make difficult choices throughout his career. Some decisions strengthened his power, while others created new enemies. Every step forward brought new risks. Over time, the pressure of maintaining power began to affect every part of his life. Trust became difficult, friendships became complicated, and every new relationship carried uncertainty. Despite these challenges, Bumpy continued to lead his organization for many years. The story of Bumpy Johnson is not simple. His life represents the complicated realities of power, survival, and leadership in a harsh environment. He was a man who understood the streets deeply, someone who navigated a dangerous world using intelligence, strategy, and reputation. For some, he represented strength and protection. For others, he symbolized the darker side of Harlem's underground economy. But one thing is certain: Bumpy Johnson left a lasting mark on the history of Harlem. His story continues to be discussed in books, documentaries, and popular culture, showing how powerful figures can shape the identity of a place and time. The balance between power, loyalty, and respect defined his career and ultimately shaped his legacy. As the years passed and Bumpy Johnson continued to build his reputation in Harlem's underground world, another powerful force constantly watched his movements: law enforcement. The authorities were fully aware that Harlem had become a center of organized criminal activity, and powerful figures like Bumpy Johnson were often the focus of investigations. However, surviving in that environment required more than strength and influence on the streets. It required intelligence, patience, and the ability to stay ahead of constant pressure from police and investigators. For Bumpy Johnson, avoiding law enforcement became one of the most difficult parts of maintaining power. During the mid-20th century, American cities began increasing efforts to control organized crime. Harlem was no exception. Law enforcement agencies started gathering information about major crime figures who were believed to be controlling illegal businesses. Because of his growing influence, Bumpy Johnson naturally attracted attention. Investigators studied his network, monitored his associates, and tried to understand how his operations worked. But proving criminal involvement was not always easy. Organized crime networks were designed to protect their leaders. Most activities were handled by multiple layers of people, which made it difficult for authorities to directly link decisions to the individuals at the top. This structure allowed leaders like Bumpy to maintain a certain level of distance from daily operations. Even so, the pressure from law enforcement never disappeared. Powerful crime figures often lived under constant observation. Detectives followed their movements, watched their meetings, and attempted to gather evidence through informants. For someone like Bumpy Johnson, this meant living a life where privacy was extremely limited. Almost every public appearance could attract attention. He had to be careful about where he went and who he met, and how he communicated with people connected to his organization. Simple conversations could be misunderstood or used against him if authorities were listening. Because of this, many organized crime figures developed habits that helped them avoid unnecessary exposure. Meetings were often held in private locations, and sensitive discussions were kept away from crowded, public places. Maintaining discipline in communication became an essential survival skill. One of the biggest threats to any criminal organization was the possibility of informants, people who secretly shared information with authorities. Informants could come from many places. Sometimes they were individuals who had been arrested and decided to cooperate with investigators. Other times they were rivals hoping to weaken competing organizations. For leaders like Bumpy Johnson, identifying potential informants was extremely important. A single leak of information could damage an entire network. Because of this risk, trust inside the organization had to be carefully managed. Associates were often tested for loyalty before being given important responsibilities. Even with these precautions, the possibility of betrayal always existed. This constant uncertainty made leadership in the criminal world extremely stressful. Throughout his life, Bumpy Johnson faced multiple legal challenges. Encounters with law enforcement were part of the reality for many people involved in illegal operations or court appearances. and legal battles became recurring obstacles that threatened his freedom and influence. Each legal case required careful handling. Skilled lawyers, strategic planning, and patience were necessary to navigate the legal system. For someone leading a large organization, even a short period of imprisonment could create instability. Rivals might attempt to take control of territories, and internal conflicts could arise within the organization. Because of this, maintaining leadership even during legal challenges was extremely important. Many powerful figures relied on trusted associates to temporarily manage operations when they were unable to oversee activities directly. Despite the pressure from law enforcement, Bumpy Johnson's reputation often worked as a form of protection. In Harlem, he was widely known, and many people understood his influence. Reputation could affect how people interacted with authority. In neighborhoods where residents already had complicated relationships with law enforcement, cooperation was not always common. This environment made investigations more difficult. However, reputation was not a guarantee of safety. The authorities continued gathering information, and the risk of prosecution always remained for Bumpy Johnson. Maintaining his reputation required constantly demonstrating strength and leadership. One of the most challenging parts of being a powerful figure in Harlem's underground world was balancing visibility with secrecy. On one hand, a leader needed to remain visible enough for people to recognize his authority. If he disappeared completely, others might begin challenging his position. On the other hand, too much visibility could attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. This balance required careful planning. Public appearances were sometimes necessary to reinforce leadership, but they had to be controlled and strategic. Meetings with associates were often limited to trusted individuals. Every action had to be considered carefully. Living under constant threat from rivals and law enforcement created enormous psychological pressure. Few people outside the criminal world truly understood how stressful this lifestyle could be. Every day involved uncertainty. Every decision could have serious consequences. For Bumpy Johnson, maintaining calm and control under pressure became one of his most important skills. Those who interacted with him often described him as someone who remained composed even in difficult situations. This ability to stay calm helped him navigate many dangerous moments. But behind that calm exterior was the constant awareness that one mistake could change everything. The underground economy of Harlem was active at all hours. Business did not stop when the sun went down, and neither did the risks. Nighttime often brought increased activity, meetings, negotiations, and interactions that shaped the balance of power in the streets. For a leader like Bumpy Johnson, rest was rare. There was always another problem to solve, another conflict to manage, or another opportunity to consider. Leadership required constant attention. Many crime figures eventually burned out under this pressure. The combination of stress, danger, and legal threats eventually overwhelmed them, but Bumpy Johnson managed to remain influential for a long time. What allowed Bumpy Johnson to survive for so many years in such a dangerous environment? The answer was strategy. Unlike individuals who relied purely on aggression or intimidation, Bumpy often approached situations with careful thought. He observed people, studied situations, and waited for the right moment to act. This strategic mindset helped him avoid unnecessary conflicts and navigate complicated situations in the unpredictable world of organized crime. Intelligence could sometimes be more valuable than strength. Even with strategy and discipline, the struggle for survival never truly ended. Law enforcement continued their investigations. Rivals continued searching for weaknesses. New challenges appeared constantly. For Bumpy Johnson, maintaining power meant facing these pressures every day. His story shows how complex and demanding leadership in the underground world could be. While many people see crime figures only through the lens of power or wealth, the reality often involves constant risk, tension, and uncertainty. Bumpy Johnson's ability to navigate that reality made him one of the most recognized figures in Harlem's history. And as the years moved forward, his influence and reputation continued to shape the streets around him, even as new challenges and changing times began to reshape the world he once controlled. Asterisk.